There is nothing as strong as the bond between mother and child, no matter the culture, no matter the time, no matter the species. Stories about mothers taking care of and protecting their children are always present, because it's the most natural thing in the world. There are even old wives' tales about motherly intuition and a mother's strength, where mothers are all but turned into superhumans when it comes to their children, able to lift cars and feel their presence at the first hint of danger, which is why cases of mothers who hurt or even kill their children fascinate and terrify the public. The idea that a mother would take away the life that she brought into the world is so foreign that most reject the concept outright because it's all too upsetting. Welcome to a new episode of Dreading. Today we are going to be covering the case of Diane Downs, a woman who in 1983 made the decision to kill her children and who, till this day, declares her own innocence, despite the fact that it simply could have been no one else. If you are interested in more videos of this nature, please hit the like button and subscribe. Also, share this video if you feel so inclined, as YouTube tends to suppress true crime content. So let us begin. If you were to ask Diane about her childhood, she would undoubtedly tell you about the years of abuse she went through at the hands of her devout Baptist parents, how they refused to allow her to follow the latest trends growing up and forced her to wear hand-me-down clothes, which caused the other teens in her area to ostracize her and treat her like dirt. That when she was around 12 years old, her father would start sexually abusing her. How when she did finally gain some independence from her family, they were quick to judge her and tell her she was taking the wrong path. However, like most of what Diane says, only 1% of what she stated was true actually was. Elizabeth Diane Downs was born in Phoenix, Arizona on August 7th, 1955, to parents Wesley, Lyndon, and Willadine Frederickson. Wesley and Willadine were incredibly young when they met and got married in 1954, and after less than a year of marriage, Elizabeth was born. According to the people who knew her, she was a plain Jane for most of her life, who tried to use her smarts to woo her peers. Her parents were strict with her, and because of their devout Baptist beliefs, didn't show Elizabeth a lot of outward affection, and they didn't allow her to do things that her friends and classmates were doing. Elizabeth had to wear hand-me-down clothes that covered her completely, and she often felt as if she was left out because of this. She felt that her parents not allowing her to follow the current trends and dress like everyone else caused her classmates to view her as a square and as a narc, and they would purposefully exclude her from events and social gatherings. She felt looked over and unloved, both by her parents and the world at large, and became obsessed with getting that external validation any way she could. She would accept any love, any outward approval, because in her mind, she received virtually none at home. Diane would later state that starting when she was 12 years old, her father began an odd practice of taking her on long car rides out into the desert, where he would force her out of the car and make her strip down to her underwear in front of him, at which time he would tell her to put her clothes back on and they would go home. She would testify that her and her father would take these drives until she was 13, where almost at once they stopped, which is odd given that sexual abuse such as this very rarely just stops. Wesley would deny this claim outright and state wholeheartedly that this never happened, and most are inclined to believe him, seeing in other statements that Diane gave throughout the years, she often felt as if her parents were quote-unquote too invested in each other to even notice her, that her parents, while strict, didn't validate her or see her in any significant way. It should also bear notice that her claims against her father were not made until she was standing trial, and they were used by her lawyers as a way to negate her odd behavior to the jury, as well as gain sympathy from onlookers. When Elizabeth was 14 years old, she convinced her father to enroll her in a charm school to help her make friends and teach her proper etiquette, but Elizabeth didn't care for her manners classes. Rather, she was drawn to learning skills like wardrobe building, skincare, and proper makeup application. These are things that her parents actively discouraged her from learning previously because of their beliefs, with her mom outright forbidding her to wear makeup. It was here where she made the decision to start going by her middle name, Diane, as a way to rebrand herself from the person most saw her as. She also made the decision to cut and dye her hair from a messy, mousy brown mop to a short, sleek blonde cut that suited her face shape. She learned what colors looked best on her skin tone, how to style any outfit for her body type, and by the time she came out of the charm school, she was a completely different person. Elizabeth, the frumpy, ugly duckling, was dead, and Diane, the blonde bombshell, had taken her place. Almost immediately, people noticed how profoundly different Diane was, especially the men in her life. Every time she would go out, she'd be catcalled or pursued. Older men would offer her rides in their cars, drinks, whatever she wanted, and Diane had never felt better. She thrived in this environment. After spending years seeking any attention she could get, she was finally being seen and pursued. People wanted to be around her, and every time she spoke, people seemed to care about what she had to say. She got a high from the attention, and from being adored, specifically from the men she was around. Something about how these men were willing to almost risk it all, specifically for her, made her feel special, superior even, especially if those men who were actively pursuing her happened to be in a relationship with another woman. This would become a trend in Diane's life, with her continuously pitting herself against other women and trying to prove her worth by getting otherwise attached men to be with her. Getting men to cheat on their girlfriends, fiancés, or wives was the ultimate high for Diane, because it meant that they were choosing her. While still in high school, Diane met Stephen Downs. Stephen was immediately enamored with Diane and thought she was enchanting. She carried herself in a way that Stephen became entranced by, thinking that she was incredibly graceful and beautiful. Stephen and Diane started to see each other rather quickly after meeting, and were high school sweethearts. Many of their classmates have commented since that they were never too far apart, consistently holding on to each other and very clearly in love, or at least Steve was in love with Diane. Her parents, however, didn't approve. They didn't like how Diane was dressing or acting. They felt as if she'd fallen into the wrong crowd, and that she was making all the wrong decisions in her life, and that would lead her down a dark path. They told her they didn't approve of her seeing Stephen, the way she dressed, her choosing to smoke, and more. However, Diane didn't care. She no longer wanted or needed their validation, as she could get it from so many others. After high school, Stephen made the decision to pursue a career in the Navy, which would take him away from Diane. Diane, for her part, made the perplexing decision to go to Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College in Orange, California. This decision was more than likely spurred on by her parents as an attempt to get her to come back to their faith. They likely thought that if they sent Diane away from Steve, and away from the bad influences in Arizona, she would realize that she had in fact made some mistakes. But that was not the case in the slightest. Even though the young couple were going to be apart, Diane and Steve vowed to stay loyal to each other. They declared their love constantly, and felt as if something as small as distance would do nothing to damper how they felt. But Diane desperately needed constant validation in the form of attention. She needed someone who was going to be there whenever she wanted them to be, who would do anything to see her and be with her, who would make her feel as if she were better than everyone else in the room. She needed that constant validation that could only come with a partner who was always physically available to her, which is why after only a few weeks apart, while at college, Diane started to cheat on Steve with multiple different men, including various staff members of the college. Diane kept cheating a secret from Steve and continued to write him as if nothing had changed. However, after only a year away, Diane was expelled from the school due to her promiscuity with one of these men, and her cheating was inevitably revealed, leading to them breaking up and her having to move back home with her parents, a fate she deemed worse than death. Despite disagreeing with her decisions, Wesley and Willadine welcomed her back to their home. Her parents had only grown more strict with her though, trying in vain to get her to conform to their Baptist ideals. And just like she had many times before, Diane rebelled. She was desperate for a way out, and almost at once, she found it. Shortly after she had moved back in with her parents, Steve came back from the Navy, and Diane, always the opportunist, saw her chance. She reunited with Steve, and despite the fact that she had cheated on him a plethora of times, spanning about a year, she convinced him to take her back, promising her fidelity to him. She told him how unbearable it was living with her parents, how she needed to escape, and she needed someone strong to rescue her. Steve, for his part, never stopped loving Diane. He had been heartbroken when he discovered her affairs, but with her in front of him, crying and stating she needed him, he was powerless. They ended up eloping in the middle of the night and began their life together as husband and wife. However, their marriage was rocky at first. Steve didn't trust Diane due to her past cheating, and was fully convinced that she was going to cheat again, something he wasn't shy about telling her. He still loved her and wanted to be with her, but the trust between them was gone. To make matters worse, Diane was actually cheating on him, often, with various men who were usually also married. But Steve had no proof of this. Diane, for her part, thought that Stephen's paranoia about her potentially cheating was stifling, and often said he was worse than her parents when they would get into arguments. Every time they would fight, Diane would make a show of her leaving and run back to her parents' home, where she would stay until Steve would apologize to her for thinking she was being unfaithful, even though she had been unfaithful. The relationship was toxic, but Steve loved her too much to leave, and Diane loved the attention. In spite of how rocky and volatile the relationship was, and how little money the couple had to support themselves, Diane made the decision to start forgoing her birth control pills in order to get pregnant. She decided to do this all on her own without telling Steve. "I got pregnant when I wasn't allowed to," Diane said. I'm not going to say he forbade me to get pregnant, but I didn't consult him. I wanted to have children, so I got pregnant without asking permission. While some have stated that Diane viewed the pregnancy as a sort of insurance in her marriage to keep Steve from leaving, Diane stated herself that she wanted to have something that loved her the way she deserved to be loved, and that children, by their very existence, give her that. Her reasons behind wanting to build a family and have children were entirely self-serving, even by her own recollection. She wanted children because of what they could do for her, not because she actually wanted to be a mother. Diane came to find that she enjoyed being pregnant, or at the very least, enjoyed the attention she received as a pregnant woman. People would treat her as if she was special, giving up their seats for her, treating her to free meals, and generally just taking care of her. She felt that people revered her and were treating her the way she deserved to be treated. But pregnancies can only last for so long, and after a year of marriage, Diane gave birth to her first daughter, Christy Ann Downs. Unfortunately, Diane didn't enjoy being a mother. In fact, she hated it. She didn't like having to be responsible for another life, and she felt like Christy took a lot of attention away from her. She had just gotten used to the people around her going out of their way to take care of her, and now it seemed like they could care less. If she walked into a room, people were more interested in her daughter. Every time someone asked her a question, it was about Christy Ann, which Diane absolutely loathed. She had worked her entire life to get people to notice her, and the fact that they now cared for her child more than her was an insult to her. Shortly after giving birth to Christy Ann, Diane decided she was going to join the Navy, leaving Steve and Christy to go to basic training. She left without telling them when she would be back, but said she would likely be back in a month. After about a week, she came back home, citing that she had extreme blisters from the absolutely grueling tasks the Navy had forced her to do. Later on, she would say that she returned home because Steve was neglecting their daughter, as he was an abusive and neglectful father, although there is no actual evidence of this. As far as the public has been made aware, Diane was never in the Navy and just seemed to go on a brief vacation to get away from their newborn child, and possibly to get people's attention back onto her and not her newborn. The addition of Christy Ann to the household didn't help ease the tension between Diane and Steve. The couple was still fighting often, with Steve noting that Diane would often neglect Christy, leaving her by herself for hours on end, and ignoring her when she was crying. Every time they would get into an argument, Diane would make it a point to take Christy and once again move back into her parents' home, knowing once again that Steve would be forced to come and apologize if he wanted to see their child. This back and forth continued until once again, 2 years after the birth of Christy Ann, Diane fell pregnant. Like she had before, this was a pregnancy that was decided and pursued solely by Diane, without Steve's knowledge. And once again, Diane enjoyed the pregnancy. People were opening doors for her, treating her with the utmost respect, and once again, after she gave birth to their second daughter, Cheryl Lynn, she became resentful. She would go on to describe Cheryl Lynn as colicky, ugly, and terrible. While she didn't like Christy Ann for taking attention away from her, she at least thought Christy was cute, and therefore a good reflection onto herself. But Cheryl Lynn was the opposite. According to Diane, she was ugly, loud, and annoying. She hated Cheryl from the moment she was born, and felt as if Cheryl made her look bad, because how could she have such an ugly baby? According to multiple neighbors, friends, and witnesses, Diane seemed especially hostile and resentful towards Cheryl Lynn throughout her life, and treated her terribly. Cheryl Lynn herself reported feeling scared of her mother, specifically because she didn't seem to like her. After 2 surprise pregnancies that his wife had planned without his knowledge, the bevy of trust issues, and their weak incomes, Steve determined that he would get a vasectomy. He felt as if their humble earnings couldn't fit more children into their home, and he also felt as if their marriage wouldn't last for very much longer, with Diane continuing to cheat and her constantly moving in and out of the home. So unlike his wife, Steve made sure to inform her of the decision, letting her know where he stood and why. Regardless of his vasectomy, Diane once again fell pregnant. This time the child was undoubtedly not Steve's, and she quickly terminated the pregnancy, realizing that there was no way she could have a baby without him knowing she had cheated. A short while later, Diane fell pregnant once more, this time by a man both she and Steve worked with that she had been seeing for months. Diane maintained that the baby was in fact Steve's to his face, and it was a miracle child, and Steve, knowing that that simply wasn't possible, still accepted the child as his own, choosing to name their newborn son Stephen Daniel Downs. The addition of Stephen to the family appeared to be the last straw for Steve. He accepted the child and never treated him as anything but his own son, but any remnant of trust he had with his wife was gone. He knew that she would continue to cheat and the marriage would only get worse, and so after a year after the birth of their son, Steve filed for divorce and left Diane. According to Diane, she was happy to be free from the marriage. She had spent the last 7 years fighting with her husband and bouncing between their home and their parents' home. But now she was free to move into her own place, albeit with her children, and live the life she always wanted. Diane tried numerous times to reconcile with Steve, wanting him to come back and take care of her and the children. Once more, she tried to state her parents, who she was once again living with, were treating her terribly, but Steve refused, realizing that he would rather be alone than with someone who spent almost a decade cheating on him. After her marriage ended, Diane had plenty of relationships with married men. She enjoyed how these men would put her before their families and be willing to risk their marriages to be with her. She felt in control for the first time in her life. If they were to ever fight or disagree, Diane would threaten to tell their wives and destroy their lives as they knew it, meaning she was rarely told no. She was in charge of the relationships, and she would always get her way. At the same time, Diane had found that she could find a way to experience the joys of being pregnant without dealing with the pain of having children. After seeing a show about a family who were unable to have a baby and were seeking a woman to be their surrogate, Diane quickly applied at multiple agencies to fill the role. She stated that she had experienced the profound joys of being a mother and wanted nothing more than to provide that experience to a couple in need. This was, of course, despite the fact that she hated her kids and usually left them, the oldest, which was 6, to take care of themselves. As part of the application process to be a surrogate, Diane was given multiple psychological evaluations. She was found to be highly intelligent. However, they noticed that Diane had narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders and was deemed psychotic. Multiple psychiatrists stated that she was unfit to be a surrogate, but still, Diane was accepted into these agencies. After a very short while, Diane was once again pregnant, this time with someone else's baby, and she was ecstatic. She was still working, still carrying on multiple affairs, and making 10 grand off of her pregnancy. But everything changed when she met Lou Lewiston. Sources about this case have referred to the man we are about to talk about as both Lou Lewiston and Robert Knickerbocker. It appears that one of these names was given as a false identity in order to protect this person's privacy. However, because most sources refer to this person by the name Lou, we will be using that. We just wanted to clarify why we are choosing to use that name, as he has been referred to by both. After Diane and Steve had gotten divorced, Diane began to work for the Postal Service in Arizona as a letter carrier. It was there she met Lou, who she immediately fell in love with. Diane herself would go on to say that prior to meeting Lou, she had never loved anyone she had been with. She would write in her diaries that her love for him filled her entire heart, and she had never felt a love that pure. All the affairs, her marriage, even her children, she couldn't say that she loved any of them, but she loved Lou. With Lou, it was different. He seemed completely different to everyone she had met before, and she simply had to have him. Upon meeting him, she pursued him, and like every other married man that Diane had set her sights on, he started having an affair with her. He stated that he didn't love Diane or think of the affair as a relationship. He just saw it as sex, something he would often tell her. Prior to meeting Diane, his wife and him had been in a rough patch. He had been content in his life in Texas. However, his wife had uprooted his life by moving them both to Arizona, a place where he had no friends or family. He was bitter about the entire ordeal, feeling as if she had taken something from him, something that he couldn't get back. And in his resentment, he decided to have a fling with Diane. He was clear with Diane, though, telling her that being with her was just sexual for him, that he didn't want to be with her, and that he still loved his wife. And he had been made aware of the prior flings she had had with other of their married co-workers. So he thought that their time together would be more of the same. By the time he had moved to Arizona, Diane had already slept with the majority of their male coworkers, and he felt as if she was down for a no-strings-attached type deal. However, he couldn't have been more wrong. Diane was obsessed with Lou. She felt as if he was her soulmate, and even though he was clear with her that he didn't want to be with her and he loved his wife, Diane ignored him. He would bring up other reasons as to why the relationship wouldn't work out as well, but Diane would ignore them, choosing to think of him as hard to get, rather than uninterested. He maintained that he would never leave his wife for her, but Diane didn't care. She wanted him to be hers completely. Diane, in an effort to show her devotion to Lou, would get a tattoo of a rose with his name under it, and pressured him to get a matching tattoo with her name on it. Lou refused, and instead got a rose on his shoulder, sans any name. It wasn't long before Lou began to worry about Diane. After they had had sex at her place one night, Diane had asked him who he loved more, her or his wife. Lou was struck by this question because he had never once told Diane that he loved her. He replied honestly and said Nora, his wife. Diane flew into a rage, screaming and cursing at him. She threatened to tell Nora about their affair and ruin his life. She swore that he'd be with her, and she was the only one who he could ever really love. Lou had never seen her like this, and instead of bending to her threats, the way every every one of her other affairs had, he immediately went and told his wife about Diane. He refused to have Diane hold this over his head or use this against him. He wasn't going to be backed into a corner by someone he hardly cared about. And so he told his wife, and almost immediately, Nora forgave him. Lou told Diane that they were over and that he was done with her. But Diane refused to believe it. She continued to pursue him at work and came to his home many times, trying in vain to get him to choose her over his wife. The fling, as Lou called it, would nevertheless continue. Lou would break up with Diane, tell her it was over and there was nothing between them, but she would persist, showing up unannounced at his home, seducing him at work, and it seemed like he couldn't say no to her. He maintained that he didn't want to be with her and that his relationship wasn't emotional for him as it was for her, but Diane didn't care. She just wanted him, and she was going to do anything to be with him, at times even stating she would kill his wife, given that she was the only thing in the way of their happiness. Diane was at the end of her rope. Lou was a challenge to her. He was all that she wanted, and she wasn't used to men telling her no, or actively choosing people over her. She wanted him to submit to be hers, to say she was the best thing to ever happen to him, but he continued to refuse. Even though they were still having sex, he refused to leave his wife for her, and Nora wasn't budging. For as hurt as she was by the affair, Lou was her husband, and she was willing to fight for him. Unfortunately for Diane, Lou had previously gotten a vasectomy, so she wouldn't be able to trap him with the child, as she had previously done. So instead, after Lou had denied her for the last time, Diane played what she thought would be her trump card. She was going to move. She told Lou that she had had enough of the back and forth. She was going to move to Cottage Grove, Oregon, to be closer to her parents, and she wanted him to come with her. They could finally be together, just them, with her kids. They could be together as a family, the way Diane had always wanted, and Lou agreed to go with her. Diane had already gotten the transfer from work and would be moving, so Lou stated that he would at some point join her. Whether he truly meant this or not, we will never know, because less than a week after she left, Lou told Diane that he wouldn't be moving to Oregon. He didn't want to be with her, he loved his wife, and most importantly, he didn't want to have kids. Lou stated once again that he loved his wife more than he loved having sex with Diane, which is all he saw their affair as, and he didn't want to drop everything he already had to raise someone else's kids. Diane was furious. Once again, her kids were getting in the way of her happiness. They hadn't fixed her marriage. They took the attention she so desperately clung to away from her, and now they were costing her the love of her life. Like she had so many times before, she refused to acknowledge Lou's statements about not loving her, his wife, and all the other reasons he didn't want to be with her, and focused solely on his statements about her children. In various letters she wrote him after his rejection, but never sent, she tried to downplay her children's role in her life. "You know, I don't want a daddy for my kids. You'd never be left alone with them," she wrote. She also became convinced that Nora had turned him against her, writing, "It doesn't matter what Nora says. I'm a little sad that she convinced you that the kids would be a burden, because I know it would not be true." Another letter read, "So what happened? I'm confused. What could she have said or done to make you act this way? I spoke to you this morning for the last time. It broke my heart to hear you say, 'Don't call or write.' I still think of you as my best friend and my only lover, and you keep telling me to go away and find somebody else. You've got to be kidding." She began to write nonstop in her diaries about Lou, writing dozens of letters to him that went unsent, trying to convince him to be with her. The more she wrote about Lou, the more she became convinced that her children and his not wanting to have a family with her were the only things that were getting in the way of her and Lou. And with knowledge in the back of her head, she began to formulate a plan. She became convinced that if she were to get her children out of her way, she could finally be with Lou, the way she always wanted to be. May 19th, 1983 was a day like any other. Christiane, Sherilyn, and Stephen Daniel had spent the majority of the day with their grandparents. After work, Diane had picked them up and made them dinner, before deciding to take her kids over to her friend Heather's home. She had seen an ad for a horse in the paper, and knowing that Heather would be interested, determined that driving all the way to her friend's rustic home would be a nice opportunity to get the kids out of the house, despite how late it was. After she had spoken to Heather and her husband for a bit, Diane wrangled her kids, and they began their drive back home. It had already dropped dark by the time that Diane and her kids had left Heather's. Nevertheless, Diane made the decision to take some back roads home, noting that her and the kids often took side roads in order to sightsee. After turning onto Old Mohawk Road, instead of the well-lit main highway and traveling a bit, Diane saw a man standing in the middle of the road next to what she described as an ugly yellow car. He was in the middle of the road, waving his arms at her, signaling as if he needed help. Diane stopped the car and proceeded to get out, leaving Christiane, Cheryl Lynn, and Stephen in their seats. She approached the man, who she described as a 5'9" white man with dark, bushy hair, and he pulled out a gun from his jean jacket. He demanded that she turn over the keys to her car, to which she refused him outright, saying, "You've got to be kidding me." He then walked over to her car, reached inside with the gun, and shot her kids. Diane, hit with the realization of what was happening, pretended to throw her keys into the darkness of the night, and when he reached for her, she fought him, pushing him and kicking him away from her, and somehow managed to get back into the car. He then shot at her twice, hitting her once in the arm, and she sped away, speeding to the nearest hospital. This is the story that Diane herself told the officers that night when they arrived at the Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon. But like most things that Diane had said, it was a lie. When Diane arrived at the emergency room that night, her demeanor was not what anyone would have been expecting from someone who had been shot at and attacked. In fact, she was remarkably calm. The emergency room staff was quick, taking all 3 kids out of the vehicle and bringing them into the operating room to assess what had happened. Cheryl Lynn, the daughter that Diane would describe as colicky, ugly, and annoying, was already dead. However, Christiane and Stephen were still alive, but only just. The doctors feverishly worked on the kids, while Diane stayed out in the waiting room, with a colorful beach towel on her arm. After the police had been called and informed of the shooting, a nurse approached Diane, for the first time noting her injury, and started working on her arm, noting how strange it was that she seemed to have wrapped her wound herself while in the car, while her kids had been shot numerous times but remained untouched. Worse still, her wound was small and seemingly superficial, while her children's wounds were grave. Diane remained calm, quiet, and detached. The doctors taking care of her children were more emotional than she was, shocked by the sight of the kids who had been shot multiple times in their sleepy town. They found Diane's demeanor off-putting, noting that at times she would smile brightly and even on occasion laugh. While Diane waited to hear about the status of her children, she made a couple of calls. The first was to Lou Lewiston, her ex, informing him that her kids, the very things that were in the way of their love, had been shot and grievously injured. She had also mentioned that she too had been shot and asked him to come and see her. She needed him more than ever, because only he could stop this pain. But he didn't answer the call, so she moved on and called her parents. Her parents rushed to her side, completely devastated at the attack on their family. Her mother couldn't believe how mere hours earlier they had all been together, and now they were fighting for their lives. When the police arrived at the hospital, they too noted Diane's strange behavior. She seemed bored, like she was waiting for a bus, not anxiously awaiting to hear if her children would survive a devastating tragedy. When it was later reported back to her that her child, Cheryl Lynn, who was only 7 years old at the time, had succumbed to her wounds and died, Diane hardly reacted. She was then informed about Christiane and Stephen. While they weren't out of the weeds yet, and both would remain in critical condition, the doctors were pleased to inform her that the kids were on the road to recovery, and there was a good chance they would be alright. Once again, Diane's reaction to this news struck all who were present as strange, because instead of thanking the doctors, praising God, or doing anything to indicate that she was happy that the 2 of her 3 kids would be making it out of this tragedy alive, Diane instead responded, "Do you mean the bullet missed his heart? Gee whiz." The police felt that this was odd, but chalked it up to shock. She had gone through a traumatic event and was coping the best she could. They asked her about what had occurred, who had shot her kids, and Diane recounted the entire story, stating that her kids had been up, laughing, and joking before she had stopped the car, and how this bushy-haired stranger had just attempted to take the lives of her kids, seemingly for no reason. In her recounting of the shooting, she also kept peppering comments about her car, and how she had just bought it and hoped it wasn't ruined. Only then did she appear outwardly worried. After hearing the story, the cops asked Diane if she would accompany them to the spot where the incident took place to start the search efforts to find the man who had shot her and her kids. Diane agreed, and once again, as they were on their way out, she commented about the car and how she really hoped there weren't any bullet holes in it as it was brand new. Never mind that the seats were stained with her children's blood and that this was the place where her youngest daughter had lost her life. Once at the intersection of Mohawk Road, where Diane stated that the attack had taken place, the cops found bullet casings that confirmed Diane's story about the shooting. Certainly, some sort of crime had taken place here, but there were no tire tracks and no sign of the man or his ugly yellow car. The police searched high and low, but all that was ever really found were the bullet casings, right where Diane said they would be. The next morning, the news crew had picked up the story of Diane and her children being attacked in the small town of Cottage Grove was rocked. People were scared, wondering who this strange man with the bushy hair could have been. Fortunately, Diane was able to recall enough about him to create a composite sketch that was distributed to the news, in hopes that anyone would know who this man was. Because of the brutal nature of the crime, the police felt like the person responsible would have had to have been seen, but strangely, despite the low population, no one came forward about seeing this bushy-haired man. But that would be the first of many things that didn't add up in their investigation. While Diane had behaved strangely the night of the incident, the police were more than happy to hand-wave her behavior. She again had just survived a horrific attack that took the life of one of her children and left the other two in the hospital. Christiane had suffered a stroke after she had been treated and could no longer speak. Meanwhile, Stephen was paralyzed from the neck down. Diane herself was in a slight cast and sling, given her own wound to her arm. So while her detached behavior was striking, they believed her story. However, as time went on, they continued to speak to Diane, and they began to realize how little her story made sense. The first glaring issue was understanding exactly what had happened. The story didn't stand up to basic reasoning. Why would Diane, a single woman traveling with children, choose to go down a deserted road in the middle of the night when she was just 20 minutes away from her own home? Why would she stop the car for a stranger who she described as dirty and scary looking? And even more, why would she get out of her car to speak with him when she would be much safer in the vehicle? Diane stated she had been in an abusive marriage and came from an abusive household and knew how to defend herself, leading to multiple investigators wondering how it was that she ended up on Old Mohawk Road that night. The second issue they had lied in the fact that the lone gunman had opted beyond reason to shoot Diane's children and not her when she refused to give him her keys. She was the only person standing in his way. He could have easily just shot her and taken the keys from her, but chose to instead attempt to murder the children. And the third most glaring issue they faced was the fact that the crime scene, Diane's own car, didn't match the crime. When Diane had described the attack, she was very clear the bushy-haired stranger was standing in the road, and she had gotten out to speak with him. After refusing to give him her keys, he had reached inside from the driver's side door and shot all of her children multiple times, at which point she faked throwing the keys into the darkness, pushed him away after he shot her, and sped off to the hospital. The event happened quickly, and her kids had all been shot in the car, but the car itself had blood splatter outside of it on the passenger side door. The more the police thought about the crime, the less sense it made. There was no way that a man had randomly done this to Diane, and no way she had gotten away with less critical injuries than her family, and no way that someone who looked out of place as the bushy-haired stranger would be able to get away without drawing attention. From that point on, the police began looking at the crime from the perspective that Diane possibly could have been the one to pull the trigger on her own children. Their first move was to talk to Diane herself, and they arranged for her to show them, on tape, what happened that night. So little of the attack made sense that they explained to her that they need to know exactly how she had been attacked, how she was able to get away with minimal damage, and how the man had been able to shoot her kids. So they went to a parking lot with her car, and using an officer as a stand-in for her attacker, had her reenact what happened. This reenactment happened days after the incident, but you wouldn't know it by watching. Diane seemed to be having a great time, laughing, smiling, and joking with the officers as if they were playing a game, and not showing them how she fought for her life mere days before. The cops felt alarmed by her behavior, but didn't alert her to the fact, or try to let her know that she was on their radar.
I'm going to do a videotape reenactment. Sitting in the car is Elizabeth Diane Downs.
Like that. I got in the car, jumped in, put the keys in. I just hit my cast. Started the car and left. The car door shut itself. God, this is worse than... Okay. Yeah. I'm sure he didn't intend to shoot my arm.
At one part of the reenactment, Diane hits her arm against the car door frame and yelps, laughing that she hurt herself to the cops. As she climbs out of the car, she states, "That hurt more than," and stops herself. Experts and those who were present believe that she was going to say, "That hurt more than when I shot myself," but realized what she was saying and stopped. Whatever doubts the investigators had that she had some part in the shooting were gone by the end of the day, but they needed more evidence. Diane had moved into her Cottage Grove apartment months before, but entire areas were unfurnished. The kids appeared to have nothing for themselves, and it felt as if they had just rolled into town. The only thing that stood out in the apartment was a small unicorn figurine that had the kids' names engraved into it, which felt oddly out of place. While searching, the police located Diane's journal. As mentioned, she had written several dozen letters to Lou that she hadn't sent, letters that detailed their affair and how she had stated that he didn't want to be with her because of her children. These letters made it clear that she would do anything to be with him, and thought that if her children were out of the way, they'd have nothing keeping them apart. However, a month before the attempt on their family's life, Diane's journal made a profound shift. Prior to April 20th, every passage had been about Lou, their love, and how she needed him desperately. But after, she began to write about her family, and her profound love for her children. The kids who she had written that she didn't care about, who wouldn't be around enough to bother Lou if he were there with her, were now her best friends. She detailed going on drives with them, seeing the sights, and even getting them the unicorn figurine, something she said was a token of her immense love for her kids. The shift was so drastic, it led to investigators believing that April 20th was the day she decided that she was going to murder her children, but only after making it appear that she was a loving mother. At the same time, Lou himself was made aware of the crimes, and he, along with his wife, flew to Oregon to talk to the police. Lou stated that the moment he received Diane's message about her children, he knew that she did it in order to be with him. He went into detail about his affair with Diane, how it meant nothing to him and how she was obsessed with him and the idea of them being together. He stated that numerous times Diane had come over to his home in the middle of the night and tried to break in while screaming at his wife, and he believed that if she were to get away with killing her kids, that she would kill his wife next. Lou had nothing to hide and gave his statement to the police, all while sitting next to his wife. Meanwhile, Diane's firstborn, Christy Ann, had woken up from her coma. After being shot, she had a stroke from blood loss, and unfortunately could no longer speak, but the doctors were sure that she would make a full recovery with time and therapy. While Christy was in the hospital, Diane was allowed to visit her, and though she couldn't speak, the moment she looked at her mother, her heart rate increased, and it was clear to everyone present that something was wrong. With Lou's statement, Christy's reaction to seeing her mother, and Diane's obsessive diary entries about getting him back, a clear motive was forming, but they needed more. Just because someone had a motive doesn't mean they are guilty of a crime, but Diane seemed to feel as if the police, as well as the public, weren't believing her story. While the police would outright deny they saw her as a suspect at this time in order to continue speaking with her, some people read her account and just didn't buy it. And enough of these people had made their thoughts known that Diane herself decided to do multiple televised interviews, declaring her innocence. These interviews were supposed to serve as appeals to the public in order to try to catch the man who had done this. But just as before, these interviews only made Diane look worse. Diane had already been evaluated and diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, as well as her narcissistic personality disorder. Diane truly believed that she was the smartest person in any room she entered, and that by virtue of that alone, she could get away with any lie. In the following interviews, you can physically see how she tries and fails to do this time and time again.
We were just out, I guess, sightseeing, I guess you'd say. And the kids got tired. They fell asleep in the car, so I decided to just head on home. But I saw a road I hadn't been on before. We like to take back roads, and just went down that road. And there was a guy standing in the road, flagging me down, so I stopped. Everything was done in a matter of 5 or 10 seconds. He swung himself around and fired twice. One caught me in the arm, the other one I went off somewhere. Danny cried the whole way. I could hear him softly just moaning, and Christy was dying. God, all the blood, all the pain.
The biggest issue that Diane has is her inability to empathize or understand what anyone outside of herself would feel in her position. Instead, she comes across as arrogant and smug whilst talking about her kids being attacked. Every interview comes across as uncomfortable, and there are times when you can see Diane's mask fall. When she recalls the events, she's flat. There is no emotion in her voice, nothing to indicate she is upset. It's as if she's reading off of a script, with no direction as to how she should be feeling.
And as I say, she may be the only one to get me out of this. Would I have brought her to the hospital? Wouldn't she be the one that I would make sure is dead? There are too many holes in it. If I had shot my own children, would I not have done a good job of it? Why would I have taken my kids to the hospital? Wouldn't I have made sure they were dead and then cried crocodile tears? That's insane to think that I would do such a thing and then bring the witnesses in against myself. That's crazy.
Diane tries to use the appeal to extreme fallacy and points to how crazy it would be to think that she would do this, because 2 of her kids are alive and she brought witnesses of her crimes to the hospital. What she doesn't account for is the fact that she thought there was no way they could have lived, because she believed she shot both of them through the heart. She also doesn't emphasize that it wasn't her because there was a man, or because she loved her children. It just wasn't her because the attempt on her kid's life wasn't successful, showing her narcissism. The interview did little to help Diane's public image, and in fact made it worse. Her clear lack of care for her children was evident. It would only get worse over time. As Diane continued to do press about the attacks, her daughter, Christy, continued to get better, and it became clear that the investigation was pointing more towards her. Diane was ordered to stay away from her remaining children and placed in foster care, citing that she had been named as a suspect in their shooting. Diane took offense to this, not because she wanted to have her kids back, but because she didn't like the fact that people thought she was guilty. She did another interview, this time stating that she wanted to be arrested, as she could prove her innocence easily.
Please arrest me so that I can prove I'm innocent so my kids can come home, and they wouldn't.
But even as she said that, the cops were finding more and more evidence against her. First, they focused on the evidence of blood splatter outside the front passenger door. Diane had stated that the kids were asleep during the altercation, and that the assailant had reached in and shot them through the driver's side of the door. But the high-velocity blood splatter told another story. Because of its height and the area of the splatter, it was clear that whatever was shot had to have been low to the ground. And given that Cheryl had been lying in the fetal position on the floor of the passenger side, the police began to get a picture of what actually happened. At some point, Cheryl must have realized what was happening and tried to flee in vain. She was able to get out of the car, but before she could run, she was shot, then placed back inside, where she was shot again. That was the only way that blood could have been splattered on the car door in that way, and if that was what happened, it begged the question, why did Diane lie? They also found that Diane had also lied about owning a .22 caliber handgun. When Diane had originally been questioned, she appeared to be incredibly forthcoming about the fact that she did own guns for her own protection, and that on the night of the incident, she had a gun in the trunk of the car that she was simply not able to get to. The 2 guns that she stated she owned, notably, didn't match the type of gun that was used in the crime, and so investigators thought little of it. However, after flying to Arizona to speak with Stephen Downs, he informed them that prior to her moving, Diane had stolen a .22 caliber handgun from him and had previously used the gun in an argument with him. According to Stephen, they had gotten into a fight about their marriage, and Diane took the gun and ran into the bathroom of their trailer, locking herself inside. She screamed at Stephen that she was going to commit suicide, and upon hearing that, he broke down the door. When he entered the bathroom, though, Diane was pointing the gun directly at him, and then shot into the floor. The bullet itself went right through the trailer and was lodged into the ground underneath. When Diane had left, and Steve had noticed the gun was missing, he put 2 and 2 together, and knew she had taken it, which again meant that Diane had been lying to them. It also just so happened that while Diane had been doing her press tour, a person who had seen Diane and the kids that night came forward and gave a very different description of events. Diane had claimed that after the shooting, she had sped away in her car, driving like a maniac to get to the hospital in order to save her children. However, a person had been behind her on the road on the way there, and they claimed that she had driven so slowly that they thought she was purposely trying to piss them off. They claimed that she was going barely 5 miles an hour on the road, and that they had to pass by. With her ex-husband's testimony, the missing gun, the blood splatter, and the fact that she had driven so slowly to the hospital with her children bleeding out in the car next to her, the police brought Diane back in for another interview, this time going over the details of the crime, and letting her know that they were not buying what she was selling. They told her point blank her story didn't make sense, and they knew that she was making it up. But Diane was a narcissist and believed wholeheartedly that she was the smartest person in any room she was in, even a room with hardened detectives and FBI analysts. She wasn't going to let these men tell her she was making anything up, and instead turned it around on them.
And your story stinks. This whole thing is it's done from the beginning.
I'm sorry.
You've changed it by saying that this guy knew you now, he knew your tattoo, he knows about you, he threatened you. That's a hell of a change from what you said the first time around.
There was no reason for you not to say that at the very beginning.
Okay. No reason in your mind. And I have one man sitting here looking at me with a face of stone, I have another man over there smoking a cigarette, 90 miles an hour, and pacing. You're not my best buddies. I wouldn't go drinking with you, that's for sure.
You feel guilty about what you did, Diane?
No, because I didn't do anything wrong. And I wouldn't change it if I could. My kids and I always took the back roads.
I'm trying to find out who shot your kids. And if it was
And I'm
you, that's the way
doing
it
what I
goes.
can. Fine, I
If it's
agree.
you, you're going to take the fall for it. If it
I
wasn't
agree.
you, then I'm going to quit this job.
I'll make you a deal, okay? Next time I remember something, yeah. You can find the guy yourself, because I know I didn't do it. And you can chase your little tails for the next 20,000 years if that's what it takes. You don't like my help, you can it.
You're real confident in yourself, aren't you?
I know that I didn't do it.
She began claiming that the person who had shot her knew who she was. They knew about her rose tattoo with Lou's name underneath. They knew about her family, and they knew she would have been there that night, which made no sense because she had never driven down that road before. She continued to say that it was possible that this was a hit put out by her ex-husband, as he had been wildly abusive towards her over the years. But the investigators doubled down, telling her that it made no sense for her to have lied about the person knowing who she was if she had nothing to do with the crime, and that she was clearly still hiding something, which further pissed Diane off. She was getting more and more frustrated, and after about an hour of claiming that it was still a singular bushy-haired gunman who seemed to know her, she stated that now it was two people who absolutely knew who she was, who shot her in the arm because, quote, no one would believe her, unquote, and who she knew but wouldn't expose.
Since you guys seem to think that I should have brought Diane with me, I will get it myself, because I know who did it.
You do know who did it.
Yes, I do. I damn sure do.
You know him by name?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
You saw him shoot your kids.
Yeah.
It's pretty important.
And I saw him grab my arm and yank my arm out and shoot my arm and say, now try to get away with it. And I'm leaving because I know who did it. Bye.
The time is now 17:46, and Diane is just departed the office. We're concluding the tape.
This claim made even less sense than the original, but at this point the police knew that they most likely weren't going to get a confession out of her because she wasn't going to crack like a normal suspect. Shortly after stating outright that she knew who killed her kids, Diane left the interview, taunting the police that she wouldn't tell them who tried to kill her kids. Pressure continued to mount on the investigation with the public, as the police wanted to arrest Diane, but the prosecution wanted to wait. They knew that if they wanted to make sure that Diane would be convicted, they would have to wait for their smoking gun, and that smoking gun went by the name Christy Ann. Christy Ann was making tremendous progress in her health. She had been able to regain her speech and had started working with a therapist to cope with the trauma from that night in May. She had been living with a foster family and her health had improved leaps and bounds. The only thing that seemed to set her back was when her father had visited her and told her mother where they would be. Diane had crashed the visit and took Christy on a multi-hour car ride. Just the two of them, which resulted in Christy Ann not speaking for a number of days, at which point her father was denied the ability to see her, and Diane was reprimanded for breaking the court order. Her therapist knew that getting her to think about, much less talk about, what had happened to her and her siblings on that fateful night would be a tall task for anyone, much less a child, and so they slowly and methodically gained Christy's trust. They first started broaching the topic by placing the song that Diane had stated was on during the attack, which was Hungry Like the Wolf by Duran Duran. When Christy would hear it, it would cause a reaction, and she would begin to remember what happened. But the therapists themselves never pressure her to tell them directly unless she was comfortable doing so. Instead, they asked Christy to write down on a piece of paper who it was that shot them that night, seal it in an envelope, and if they didn't want to tell them who it was that hurt them, at the end of the session, she could place it in the fireplace. It was paramount that Christy trust her therapist after everything she had been through, so no effort was made to salvage the papers, or to try to pressure her into something she wasn't comfortable with. Instead, every time they would meet, Christy would write down who had hurt her, seal it, and throw it into the fire, until one day she decided to tell them who it was who had hurt her, and she stated it was her mom. When the therapist asked her to recount what had happened that night, Christy gave a similar account to what her mother had told the police that first night. They had spent the day with their grandparents, had dinner at her apartment, and then gone with their mom to her friend Heather's home. After they left Heather's, Diane turned onto Old Mohawk Road, and at an intersection, stopped the car and got out. She didn't, however, talk to anyone on the street. Instead, Diane went to the trunk of the car, pulled out a small handgun, and shot her and her siblings, and then shot herself in the arm, wrapped her arm up in a beach towel she had brought with her, and slowly made her way to the hospital, taking as much time as she could in the hopes that all her kids would perish before they got there. After Christy's statement, 9 months after the shooting, Diane was arrested on 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempted homicide. All Diane wanted since she was a little girl was attention, and when she went on trial for the attempted murder and murder of her children, she finally had gotten it. As gruesome as it would seem to anyone with an ounce of empathy, Diane was excited to be going to court because of all the media attention she had gotten. The public on the whole didn't believe her story, and she was seen widely as a monster, but Diane didn't care. She thought she was smart enough and compelling enough to get everyone back on her side, and that she was the victim in all this. And in order to help sway public perception and get people back on her side, the first thing Diane did was get herself pregnant. However, unlike every other time she had done so, this pregnancy didn't benefit her. If anything, it caused the public to be even more sickened by her. People already believed that she had been a part of the plot to kill her children, if not the person who was solely responsible. So her showing up, noticeably pregnant, was absolutely horrifying. She then did a series of interviews without her lawyer present, which only worsened her public image. These clips are from a rebroadcast of the original interview, which is why the title card under Diane states, "Convicted Murderer."
This man shot my daughter. My first reaction was to snap back to my childhood, to the pain that had happened to me back then, my marriage, my entrapment by society. This man was bigger than me. He was stronger than me. He had more power because he had a gun. And I stood there and I looked at Christy reaching, and the blood that just kept gushing out of her mouth. What do you do?
The narrative that Diane is creating about the moment her daughter was shot is entirely selfish. Instead of saying that she felt compelled to act because of her love for her daughter and her want to save her, she states she remembered her own childhood and how she has been victimized by society. This is all too fantastical to be true.
The gun kept firing and firing and firing, and it was monotonous. It just kept going. It was like a slow motion picture. When he swung around, he was pointing. When he swung around, it hit the tips of my fingers. The gun hit the tips of my fingers, and that snapped me. And I went, wait a minute. I'm not trapped by society. I don't care if he is bigger. If I stand here and I say, yeah, here, take the keys. I mean, there's nothing I can do. You win because you have the gun. My kids are going to die. And I'm not going to let my kids die. And so instead of giving him the keys, I feigned throwing the keys. He did not take time to point the gun and shoot me, obviously, because he would have shot me the same way he did the kids. When he was swinging in the direction of the keys, firing the gun, he hit my arm. Everybody says, you sure were lucky. Well, I don't feel very lucky. I couldn't tie my damn shoes for about 2 months. It is very painful. It is still painful. The scar is going to be there forever. I'm going to remember that night for the rest of my life, whether I want to or not. I don't think I was very lucky. I think my kids were lucky. If I had been shot the way they were, we all would have died.
Instead of focusing on the children and focusing on the fact that one of her kids lost their life, the other suffered a stroke, and the other is paralyzed, Diane states that she is in fact not lucky because she couldn't tie her shoes. Every response she gives is entirely focused on herself, because she is the most important person in her own narrative. She doesn't love or care for her children more than what they can do for her, and she shows that very obviously. Her kids were not lucky. They were traumatized. Diane so entirely lacks empathy that she can't surmise anyone else's experience in a way that doesn't revolve around her. In her narrative, she is the hero, and she will go as far as to say her kids, one of which was killed, were lucky because she was able to get them to the hospital.
The blood splatters on the outside of the car showing Downs shot Cheryl outside of the car.
We saw pictures of this so-called spatter. It's drops. When they took the kids, they took Chris and Cher out of the driver's side of the car, and it's blood droplets. What do I see most is blood coming out of Christy's mouth, because that's what I see. I can't see Danny, and I can't see Cher. Sherry was laying on the floor. Danny is just crying real soft, so that sound stays in my mind. When I go to bed, I cry at night. Even now, I still cry. I dream about Cheryl. But at night, when I close my eyes, I can see Christy reaching her hand out to me while I'm driving, and the blood just keep coming out of her mouth. And that, maybe it'll fade too with time, but I don't think so. That haunts me the most.
Diane just got finished talking about how the image of her daughter choking on her own blood and dying in the passenger seat of her car haunts her, and then she smiles. This is by far one of the most horrifying clips of Diane, because it just goes to show how detached from humanity she actually is. She doesn't feel empathy towards her own daughter. She doesn't feel pain about her daughter's death, and she is entirely unaware that smiling after giving that statement is not something a normal human should be doing. Instead, she smiles at the interviewer, thinking, beyond all reason, that she is being convincing, and she is fooling them, and that by smiling, she is coming across as down-to-earth and relatable to the interviewer.
But what of Downs' fourth child, the baby, about to be born?
I'd like to see him try to take this baby from me. And how? I got pregnant because I miss Christy and I miss Danny and I miss Cheryl so much. I'm never going to see Cheryl on earth again. And you can't replace children, but you can replace the effect that they give you. And they give me love, they give me satisfaction, they give me stability, they give me a reason to live and a reason to be happy, and that's gone. They took it from me. But children are so easy to conceive.
This clip buried her in the eyes of the public. There was already a narrative forming about how Diane viewed her kids as pawns to be used for her own benefit, and stating that she was using this pregnancy and this child to replace Cheryl was absolutely abysmal for her reputation. She made it clear in one sentence that her kids were nothing to her, and she could replace any of them at any time. These interviews would only worsen public opinion on Diane, but nothing compared to the trial. At the trial, the defense was an uphill battle. They had to do their best to explain away the mountain of evidence, including Christy Ann's eyewitness testimony, as well as explain why 2 months after the shooting, Diane had suddenly changed the story, said she knew who had attempted to kill her and the children, and why she said she wouldn't corroborate with the police. They also had to try to get the jury on Diane's side, despite how utterly unlikable she was. In order to do this, they attempted to argue that Diane was socially inept because of her upbringing. She had no idea how to properly behave in social situations, and that often manifested itself in her inappropriate actions. They stated that her parents never allowed her to cry, to express herself, and so when she felt sadness, she would often end up laughing. When the song Hungry Like the Wolf was played in court, the song that both Diane and Christy had stated was playing whilst the shooting occurred, Diane began to dance in her seat and sing along. The defense also tried to dispel the narrative that Diane was promiscuous or often sought relationships with married men by stating that she'd only been with 10 men in the past 2 years, and only half of those men were married. This argument failed to convince any of the jurors, half of which were married women themselves. When Christy Ann was brought up to testify against her mother, she told the same story she had when she first spoke about the event in therapy. However, Diane's lawyers tried in earnest to argue that Christy Ann had been coached by them and had false memories planted in her head, that Christy wasn't actually scared of her mother and was simply being turned against her by the state in order to quickly and efficiently close this case. But once again, this argument only seemed to further alienate the jurors, who now saw Diane's lawyers as bullies towards a young girl. At Diane's own request, she was put up on the stand. Once more, Diane thought if she could just speak her mind, she would be able to manipulate everyone into believing her side, despite the fact that up to this point, she had not been successful at convincing anyone of her innocence. She felt as if that was just because people weren't really listening to her. When asked by her lawyers about what happened that night, Diane once again reverted back to her original story. A man had randomly shot her and her kids, and it was all some bizarre carjacking gone wrong. When asked why she changed the story, she maintained that she wasn't sleeping, and had simply confused nightmares she had about that night with what really happened, and that it was all a big misunderstanding. She went further to state she had no motivation to kill her kids, and that her feelings for Lou weren't actually as strong as the prosecution made them out to be. Diane admitted she loved him, and that she still felt like he was the only person she was able to love with her entire heart, but that didn't mean she wanted to kill her kids for him. Diane's testimony came off as condescending, nonsensical, and rude. If any jurors had been on the fence about her story, they quickly found themselves rooting against Diane, simply because of how smarmy she came off. Things only got worse for her when the prosecution cross-examined Diane, and she was forced to admit that she did seek out men in marriages for affairs. She didn't really like her daughter Cheryl Lynn, and more. Diane's testimony buried her, and after the defense prosecution gave their closing arguments, the jury came back with the verdict of guilty. Diane was sentenced to life in prison, with her becoming eligible for parole after 25 years. However, this is not where the story ends. 3 years after her conviction, Diane escaped from prison by scaling the 18-foot fence, putting her jacket over the barbed wire at the top of the fence, and simply walking away. Diane had the address of a former cellmate's husband that had moved close to the prison to be closer to her, and Diane simply walked to his home, knocked on the door, and asked if she could stay there. And while he didn't know who she was, like Diane had done so many times before, she managed to seduce him, showing him her boobs in return for lodging. They quickly began an affair, and he hid her in his home for 10 days, during which time he stated he fell in love with her. When Diane went missing, a huge manhunt was initiated. Christiane and Stephen immediately were put into protective custody, because most believed Diane would try to get some sort of revenge on her children, especially Christy. However, after less than 2 weeks, she was found and immediately transferred to a prison in New Jersey. Since her transfer, she has seemingly been a model prisoner and has gone up for parole twice. She still claims that she is innocent, and during her parole hearings provides ridiculous reasons as to why she is innocent and should be let out of prison.
I have spent the past 25 years trying to find answers as opposed to learning how to cut hair or repair air conditioning units. I know is that I did not murder my children, and 1 year after my uncle was murdered, my children and I were attacked for no reason at all. Why is my uncle and his contact from the State Department and their Israeli contact in this book?
Did not commit these murders? Or the murder and the other crimes you were convicted of?
Absolutely. I didn't commit them, and I still maintain my innocence. Somebody in the road flagged us down. I stopped and got out of my car, and he said something to the effect of, "I want your car." And I laughed at him. And I said, "You've got to be kidding." Because in my mind, those kinds of things don't happen. In Arizona, those things don't happen. I don't know about Oregon, but in Arizona, those things don't happen. And so he jumped into the car, leaned into the car, and started firing the weapon. And it happened so quickly that by the time he stood up and faced me, it was over. I mean, it was just that fast. He said something about the car again, and I struggled with him. The gun discharged. He fell back. I jumped in the car, put the keys in the ignition, and took off. The car door shut by itself. That's it. And I went to the hospital. Christy and Danny were in the back seat. When we got to the hospital, they were still crying. The nurses reported that they were still crying. The state says that I was the one that shot them and that I wanted them dead. If that was the case, I would not have taken them to the hospital still crying. There are so many other ways to accomplish such a horrific deed if I was going to do it. I'm certainly bright enough to figure out another way besides some way that looks so absolutely insane and hokey that nobody would believe it. I'm not dumb.
Ultimately, you told several different versions of the story when law enforcement investigated this, correct? When you talked.
Not correct.
Ultimately, well, I understood that you told law enforcement that this was done by two men with ski masks.
This is what somebody told me. How do I explain this? After my children and I were attacked, the police kept saying, "Diane, you must have lapses in your memory because there's holes in this you could drive a semi-truck through. None of this makes sense. You're forgetting something." I believed, because I'd never had any dealings with authorities, and I believed the authorities, and so I thought they did, that I had lapses of memory. I can't tell you how the towel got around my arm, so I know from my own personal experience that I did have at least that much of a lapse of memory. I don't know how the towel got around my arm. So when when people would call me up and people would say, "I know so-and-so and he said such and such." I have another guy would call and say, "I have a neighbor and he has a car that just looks just like that and he's been talking." These kinds of things were being said to me either by phone. People would stop me on my mail route. I worked in Cottage Grove, and people would drive all the way to Cottage Grove just to meet me on my mail route and tell me these kinds of things. So I would call the police, or I would go to the police and I would say, I would say, this is what's being told to me. Those are the kinds of things they would say that I changed my story. I wasn't changing my story. I was trying to help. The police kept saying I had lapses of memory. People were calling me and telling me things that I thought, well, maybe this is what happened that I don't know. And so I would tell the police, believing that I was helping them investigate. They didn't tell anybody that these are reports, that I was giving them reports from other people. They would simply say, Diane came in and said such and such. The one about the ski mask was dreams that I was having. And they kept saying, well, maybe you forgot something. So when I would have a dream and I would wake up, I would think, well, maybe that's what I would forget. And so the ski mask story, I didn't tell the police. I was talking to somebody on the phone, and I was I was sharing this dream, this thought with somebody, trying to understand in the same way that you would talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, so that you can, because if you talk, maybe you can reach something, maybe you can find something that's inside you that's locked off. And so I was sharing this with somebody else, and the police were tape recording those phone calls and then said, oh, there she goes, she changed her story. And that wasn't it, and they know that wasn't it.
Okay, well, ma'am, I guess perhaps you could clarify it for me, because as you said, I am the newest person here, and I'm asking you new questions. But when I'm reading the pre-sentence investigation, it says, subsequently, defendant gave a total of 3 different versions of the shooting, including that it was done by 2 men wearing ski masks, and also that she knew the person shot them. Did you not give 3 different versions of the story?
The police said, strangers don't shoot strangers for no reason. So I believe this had to be somebody who knew me. They also, at one point, the last day that I got to see Christy in the hospital, I believe it was June 15th of '83, Doug Welch came to the hospital and said, Steve Downs did this. We know Steve Downs did this. You need to be willing to testify against him. I said, how do you know Steve Downs, my ex-husband? How do you know Steve Downs did this? Give me the evidence. He said, don't worry about the evidence, just be willing to testify. I said, if you can't prove to me he did it, he's not the one that fired the gun. He said, but he was behind it. I said, I cannot testify against somebody unless you can prove to me that he did this. I know he hates me, but why would he hurt the kids? Doug Welch said, you better be willing to play ball or you'll never see your kids again. And I said, I cannot testify against somebody unless you can prove to me that he did it. The next day when I went to see my children, I was not allowed to see my children ever again. That gave me the belief that the police were absolutely convinced that somebody I knew did this. And if the police believed it, then I believed it. Now, if they want to turn this all around and say, Diane changed her story, that's not what happened. And you guys are on the parole board, and I know you work with the legal authorities. You work with police, you work with the district attorneys, and so you know how they work. It's how I know now what they were trying to do. They were trying to scoop me into a corner so that, I don't know, so that I would say or do something that would incriminate me, which certainly worked. But that's not what happened. Though what I'm telling you is exactly what happened. Doug Welch came to the the hospital in Springfield. Oh, I can't even think. Mackenzie Willamette. No, anyway, to the Springfield hospital. He sat right there. He caught me when I was coming through the front door. He pulled me into the lobby. And these are the things he said to me. I went to see Christy for 15 minutes because that's all I was allowed. I left, and he was standing there, and he goes, I'm not playing, Diane. And I said, prove to me Steve did this. He says, let us worry about the proof. And I said, I can't testify against him unless you can prove to me he did this. And I left. The next day, I did not see my children ever, ever again until court. And that was it. And so I believed. I believed what I thought the police believed. Now, maybe they did believe that. Maybe to this day they still believe it, because Fred Hughey was, another time he told my attorney, Jim Jagger said, Fred, you know Diane is innocent. He said, I know that and you know that, but she's covering for somebody, and as long as she's going to cover for somebody, she's going to do that person's time. Jim Jagger said, go ahead.
I said, so is it what you're saying today is that the prosecutor in your case knew you were innocent, yet in order to get someone else, to convict someone else for this, he basically threatened to keep your kids from you in order to get you to make incriminating testimony against somebody else? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that Jim Jagger told me Fred Hugie said this to him. I don't know that Fred Hugie said this. I have no reason to believe Fred Hugie said this now. But that's what Jim Jagger told me Fred Hugie said. So from that point on, I believed, from that point on, I believed that Fred Hugie believed that it was somebody that I knew. That's what I'm telling you. That is what shaped my belief patterns. And so when I would talk to the police, I spoke to the police as if it was somebody that was familiar to me. Not because I believed they were familiar to me, but because Fred Hugie told Jim Jagger, and Jim Jagger told me that Fred Hugie told him this. I have no reason to believe Fred Hugie would do that. I don't. Fred Hugie adopted my children, I think, during the trial. Can I go ahead and jump ahead with this?
Sure.
Okay. During the trial, at the very end of the trial, Fred Hugie, they brought in a mock-up of the car, and Fred Hugie got a gun, and he was reenacting the crime. And when he was going through the motions of firing the gun at the Christy doll and at the Cheryl doll and at the Danny doll, he couldn't shoot the Danny doll because the Danny doll was back here. And he raised up and he looked at me, and I went like this, and he went, his face, he had a look of incredulation on his face, and his mouth started to open, and I nodded my head yes, and he had to switch the gun to the left hand. A right-handed person could not have shot the Danny doll. It was at that time, I don't think at any time before that did Fred Hugie believe that he was doing anything wrong. I think that he believed full bore that what he was doing was the right thing. But, and I'm not inside Fred Hugie's head, I don't have the right to speak for him, and I won't speak for him, but it was after that he adopted my children, and according to Christy, never said a bad word against me. Ever. That was out of Christy's mouth. Fred Hugie, in all the time that he raised her, never spoke ill of me. I believe that Fred Hugie knows that there is a man out there that was hunting my children, and it wasn't until after Christy told her schoolmates that she drew pictures in school, and she said, "This is the man who shot us." I lied in court because they wanted me to say this and they wouldn't leave me alone. Dr. Peters, she said, Dr. Peterson kept pressuring me and he wouldn't leave me alone. Those children, the Andresens, told their mother told her, the apartment manager, and the apartment manager told somebody. Now, he didn't tell my attorney until 1991, but he apparently told somebody before that. But it was at that time when Christy was in that school and classmates with the Andresen twins that Fred Hugie decided to adopt my children.
Well, good. I know.
So, yeah, we talked about that. Oh.
You had conversations about your needs, but have you thought about their needs? Because your case obviously has attracted some attention. How will it be for them with all the potential attention that you living with them might bring upon them? Have you thought about their needs in this?
Yes. Every time I call home, I ask them, can we please move? I want them to move to another place. When I used to file legal work, back before I finally got my answers, and you check and see when my legal work all stopped. It's when I finally got the answers and I was finally able to calm down and just be me again, about 2005. But back in the day when my dad would file, I would write everything, my dad would type it, my mom would copy it, and she would do the filing for all of my legal work. Well, my dad, on the filing page, that's the certificate of mailing, you have to sign your name. My dad would always put his address. So everybody knows where my parents live. And so every time I would talk to my parents on the phone, not every time, at least once a month when I talked to my parents on the phone, I would say, please, can we move someplace else? I would like to live someplace else where nobody can find you, because people are going to be coming by the house all the time, wanting to peek in the windows, wanting to heaven knows what. And I don't want us to have to deal with heaven knows what. My dad's 80. He had a stroke 2 years ago. He's very thin. He's lost 30 pounds. He stumbles. He falls. My goodness gracious, when they were here in August, his whole arm was bruised. I was scared to death that my mom was going to be arrested for battery of an elder because, and I asked, what happened to you? My mom says he falls now. And I do not want my parents to have to worry about when my mom has to go out and get groceries because she can't get my dad to go in the car. It's easier for my dad to just stay at home. I don't want my mom to have to worry about when she has to go grocery shopping. Is somebody at the end of Quarter Mile Road going to be there throwing tomatoes at the car or wanting a signature or can you sign my book or whatever? I don't want and so I would ask them, please, please just move. And it wasn't until May of this year when it was finally time. They know by ORS 144.228 that my parole date was May 9th. And so in April, my mom said, I've decided we're going to move and not tell the kids where we're going. I said, okay. But so my parents finally said yes, that they will move. Unfortunately, for me to move, I have to tell you guys where I'm moving, and it's the same as telling the media where I'm moving, and telling the media is telling the wackos, because somehow the wackos always seem to know everything. And the only thing that I can ask is, please, if you do parole me and you allow us to transfer to another state, someplace, please don't tell anybody where we are. I mean, it's the only way that I can keep my parents safe. I'm not worried. Come on, I live with 4,000 of the worst people in humanity, and it's a washing machine. It keeps turning over and turning over. We in California, we parole 11,000 people a year, and they come right back. So I'm not concerned about my safety, but my parents are old. If you think that it's better for me to parole someplace and never see my parents again, and that's the only way to keep them safe, then I would do that. But I don't want to not see my parents again. I love my parents. My dad needs me to take care of him. He's 80 and he falls. He's a big man. My mom's a little woman. She doesn't, when it finally comes time to start bathing him and taking care of him, my mom isn't going to be able to do that by herself. Sending me someplace away from my parents would not be good for them. I could do it. I could do it. I've certainly dealt with, I've lost my children. Once somebody takes your children from you, taking your parents is, what's next? But my parents really need me. And so if you're going to parole me someplace to hide me, like you did Janice, well, like the others did Janice Freeman, that's great. But hide my parents too, please. It was back in 85. I saw the eyebrow. It was back in 85. Janice Freeman, when they paroled her, they didn't tell the media where she was. And if you're going to do that for me, do it for my parents. Don't do it for me. Do it for my parents, because they do not need the kookaloos. And I know, there you go. There's some insight. This is what insight has done, because I know what kookaloos. I live with kookaloos every day. I've become inured to it. You don't ever get used to kookaloos, but you learn how to survive them. My parents don't know how. My parents don't. My mom will do the same thing that I did back in 83. She'll get a phone call and she'll go out to meet somebody. My parents. Please don't parole me away from my parents. They need me. They as much as you think I'm a danger to them simply because of the kookaloo factor, if the kookaloos can't find me, they'll go to my parents. They will. They will. They'll do whatever it takes, because I know what they do in here.
Ms. Downs, I'm pleased to hear that you've been able to keep your relationship up with your parents. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just getting some tissue. Oh, I didn't think I was going to need these this time. Thank you.
Okay. Take your time.
Okay.
What you've been able to maintain with parents. Any other relationships that you've been able to maintain that you'd like to share with that might help you if you release in the community? Are you involved in a romantic relationship at all? Any friendships or anything?
No, none that take me there. None that I would need. No.
To Diane, life is expendable. She is the only person who matters, and she would do anything to get what she wanted. Cheryl Lynn was a bright, beautiful young girl who lost her life for no reason, and her siblings' lives were forever altered because Diane couldn't handle rejection. Luckily, she will most likely never be released from prison, and she will never be able to harm anyone other than herself ever again. If you liked this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. If you have any case you would like us to look into, leave it in the comments down below. Have a great day, and remember to stay safe.